dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic.
This is Matt Pegas.
And this is episode 47, where we are going to discuss the oeuvre, the French word for the corpus of work of none other than Mel Gibson, a man we are all very familiar with. In fact, I believe Twitter is populated by many Mel Gibson fan handles and accounts, and for good reason, because to the extent that there is an our guy in Hollywood, well, it's probably Mel, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as Dan said, today we're going to talk about the body of work of Mel Gibson and just Mel Gibson as a artist and as a filmmaker. Obviously, as you alluded to, there's a lot of kind of meme appreciations for Mel Gibson on Twitter in terms of, people using handles and posting memes. I would make a distinction here. There's a kind of one side where Mel is celebrated on our side for certain things that he has said, certain things he said under the influence of alcohol or, in other compromised ways, but nevertheless, that things that people either agree with or simply find amusing, kind of similar to Kanye West more recently. But there's this other side to Mel beyond just kind of appreciating that transgressive public figure stuff, which is that, and this really comes through in the movies, I think he really is a great artist and a great filmmaker, and one of a right-wing bent. I mean, not I don't need to go into a diatribe comparing and contrasting him with Kanye West, but more recently this sort of Kanye stuff, it's a little more jokey, and some people may like his music, but no one would really call his music right-wing, even if he now is that politically. Whereas with Mel, all of the sort of more meme level of appreciation of him aside, works like The Passion and Apocalypto and Hacksaw Ridge to a slightly lesser extent, but nevertheless, and some would argue Braveheart as well, that these are very not only very great films, but ones that have a real, if not right wing, then at least, very viscerally appealing message about violence and masculinity. My own history with Mel, I saw The Passion a while ago, basically probably in middle school, in kind of a Catholic context. And I hadn't really, I obviously, as you said, a lot of people talk about Mel online. I hadn't really delved back into his work. I kind of thought it might be good and probably underappreciated for sort of political and politically correct reasons, but I didn't necessarily think that he was like one of the great filmmakers or anything. And when I more recently, after a trip to Mexico, turned on Apocalypto, I was quite blown away with just how deep, nuanced, and artistic of a film that is. And it kind of made me realize I actually haven't seen The Passion in some time. I have to delve into some of his other work, which I intend to do. I know you've seen somewhat more of it, Dan. But yeah, that was basically my takeaway, realizing that yes, Mel Gibson has said this, that, and the other thing, but also, I mean, he's a real one. He's a real artist and a real filmmaker.
Yeah. So I had the same experience with Apocalypto. I always thought it was just some kind of random action movie and set among the Mayans in Mexico. And so I decided to watch it. I think, it was bandied about on right-wing Twitter as a movie to see. I knew that Mel directed it, and I was blown away. Like we're gonna talk about it more, but yeah, it's a tremendous movie. Like Mel, essentially, the movies he's directed are few. He's directed Braveheart, he's directed The Passion, he's directed Apocalypto, he's directed Hacksaw Ridge, and they are
Yeah.
all phenomenal.
Yeah.
And so, like, first and foremost, Mel is an amazing artist. And I mean, that is true of, I think, many people would say of Kanye as well. But as you note, Kanye is, his art is not necessarily, it's not right wing in any discernible sense.
Yeah. Which would be hard
Whereas,
for, maybe
yeah,
it's an unfair comparison, but nevertheless, yeah, definitely.
whereas Mel's films are, they are great works of art, but they are, of course, influenced by his perspective. So this goes back to, I think, that kind of heuristic that I set up, or that maybe it was Lomez who set it up, and I copied it from him.
Yeah.
But that we're not looking for right wing art. We're looking for right wing artists making art. And if
Yeah.
you're a right wing artist making art, your art will reflect that worldview. And so, in very obvious and aesthetically significant ways, Braveheart, The Passion, Apocalypto, and Hacksaw Ridge all have and Apocalypto, I said Apocalypto,
Yeah.
they all embody this right wing kind of ethos, which essentially boils down to a sort of not right wing like Koch brothers, libertarian, whatever. Like, no, this is like the old right. This is the right that we talk about on our side of Twitter. This is traditionalism.
Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not, with some exceptions that you can definitely point to. There's not a lot of ideology in these movies as much as, yeah, as you said, reflecting a
Traditional value
right
scheme.
wing, somebody. What's that?
A traditional value scheme,
A
bringing it
traditional
back
value
to
scheme, and
tradition.
also a, for lack of a better word, based understanding of violence, masculinity, and struggle, which I think kind of leads us to what
Yeah,
you pointed out, and what I completely agree with as the sort of overriding theme of all Mel Gibson's, certainly everything he's ever directed. You could even probably make some kind of aesthetic argument that he embodies this in his presence in film he's simply acting in.
absolutely.
Certainly in Dragged Across Concrete, which we'll talk about. But basically, in all of his work, Mel is concerned with transcendence, redemption, and or some kind of triumph, won through significant suffering, often violence and suffering. This is clear in the Christ, in the story of Christ, for sure. But it's also definitely with William Wallace in Braveheart, yelling out freedom as he's being tortured at the end, and also in the character in Apocalypto, who I believe is named Jaguar Paw, because we are dealing with a member of a tribe, but nevertheless, it shows him. He goes through harrowing experience, almost basically being sacrificed in a Mayan city after having his tribe totally destroyed. From there, Apocalypto kind of becomes this harrowing chase movie through the rainforest, and harrowing violence and other natural calamities ensue. But we just kind of pointed this as a through line in all of his work, is this idea of heroism and overcoming, or even religious transcendence in the case of Christ, coming through violence and coming through suffering. It's obviously something that is very much brain. And then Hacksaw Ridge as well. It's slightly different there. That Hacksaw Ridge is notable, unlike most of his other films, except I suppose with the exception of The Passion. The protagonist is a pacifist, so does not commit violence, but he is, he wins a Medal of Honor. He's obviously adjacent to violence, so that is a slightly tweaked there theme, but nevertheless, it really is a through line that's obviously on his brain.
Yeah, Yeah, and that they all transcend, achieve a kind of spiritual victory through physical suffering, through their own physical suffering. And that obviously is, very, front and center in the Passion. And I think that that idea of victory, if not victory on this earth, but an eternal
Mhm.
victory through suffering, is something that he probably has come to through Christianity.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's the other point to make here. Obviously, a lot of people on our side and listening to this podcast will be very sympathetic to Mel's traditional Catholicism, and he's not just your average trad Cath either. He is a Sede Vacantist, or at least his father was. It's not always crystal clear where Mel precisely stands, but in any case, he's a very firmly believing and traditionalist Catholic. I say not always sure where he stands because I think he has some relations with, the mainstream of the Catholic Church too. So Sede Vacantism, for people who don't know, is obviously very and explicitly separate from that. His father, Hutton Gibson, who we'll touch on because it would be remiss not to a bit later on, is a prominent, Sede Vacantist, basically denier of the legitimacy of Vatican II and all of the popes that have come after that. Sede Vacantism meaning, basically vacated seat, that there is no rightful pope following Vatican II. That is the basic Sede Vacantist belief. That's a bit of an aside, but it's part of the context. Basically, Mel was brought up with that religion, and still obviously has respect for it in some kind of way. His father passed away, I believe, 2 years ago. But Mel obviously is very rich from his movies. He funded one of the very few Sede Vacantist churches here in Malibu, California, or nearby where I am
Oh
in
wow.
Malibu, California, which is
Huh.
so I say all this to say, Mel has said
You
some
gonna
things that
check it out,
obviously.
Matt?
What's that? Oh, yeah,
You
it's
gonna
very
check it
hard to.
out?
I've tried. I've tried, and it's naturally extremely private. It's on gated land, very far from the road. There might be a website, but it's not. It's not. And many would argue that this is a weakness of certain ultra traditionalist, schools of thought. Well, or is it a weakness or a strength? I don't know, but basically you can't just join up. Like, I don't know, you have to know somebody, or prove your salt or something, which makes sense given, again, just how, I mean, I don't think most of our listeners need an education in this, but just given how traditionalist, like, this isn't just like conservative Catholicism, this is a radically traditionalist posture of a group, completely not only against modernity but against the Catholic Church as it stands now. So it's naturally controversial. Mel has some kind of relation to it. He's also, in some ways, a man of the world, and in some ways has relations with the mainstream of the Catholic Church. So it's being long-winded here, not exactly clear where he stands to the Sede Vacantist question, but in any case, it was what he was brought up with, and that level of traditionalism deeply informs his work. Of that, there is no doubt. And I think I was trying to make another point before I went on that aside, which is that regardless, you could be a traditionalist Catholic or you could be an atheist, and you could still, I think, see that that regardless of where you stand on the literal truth value of these religious views, that his passion, no pun intended, the seriousness with which he takes that view is what animates his work. There's no doubt about that. Obviously, in the Passion, but even just with this theme of transcendence through suffering, even in something totally pre-Christian, right up until the very end, like Apocalypto, that same understanding of the world as a place of suffering, but of the possibility of transcendence through that, which is obviously very Christian,
Yeah.
is what animates this guy's work the same way drugs and chaos magic animated William S. Burroughs, where, you know what I mean, like, it's like,
Yeah. So
yeah.
crucially in Braveheart, in his moment of doubt and pain, as it were, as he's not nailed to a cross, but he is being tortured, William Wallace, on something that is like a cross, with his arms splayed out and his legs. And I believe he's being disemboweled. And he cries out freedom at that moment. And that is like a very, like, of course, intentionally Christ-like moment. And of course, during the Passion, Jesus's moment of doubt and pain was, portrayed as it was, in the Bible. And he is, on the cross crying out, God, why have you forsaken me? What have you? And that is all portrayed. And it occurs to me now, as we're saying this, that, at the kind of the climax, the crescendo of Apocalypto, when he is about to kind of like face his, he's running through the forest, this jaguar paw guy, he's being hunted by this rival tribe, and they're about to catch up to him. It's about to be the end. And then suddenly he sees the conquistadors coming in on their boats. He sees the cross. And at that moment, it's like the apex of, kind of, if not in his case, physical suffering, the moment of truth when he is about to be slain. He sees the cross. And so that's a theme that's repeated throughout his movies. I'm sure there's something similar to it in Hacksaw Ridge, where at the moment of kind of like greatest self-overcoming, or at the moment of like greatest sacrifice, or which is a sort of self-overcoming, to kind of submit to one's sacrifice, that is a holy moment. And that I realized just as I'm thinking about it, that's in all of his movies. The
Definitely, yeah. I mean, in Apocalypto, crucially, he doesn't end up getting killed in that moment, but it is kind of that same thing where the cross comes at a moment of extreme violence and danger. It's kind of interesting. I'm trying to remember the exact mechanics of the scene, but basically it's him and the two Mayan, warriors from the Mayan civilization that were after him to kill him. They kind of come to the beach, I believe, at the end of the chase, and they're all so awestruck by these boats of a sort they've never seen, with the crosses on the sails, that I believe what happens is Jaguar Paw retreats to the woods, and the Mayans go out to meet the conquistadors. And I don't want to do too much of a quote unquote close reading on that. I don't know what the significance is, if the Mayans, being from the technically more advanced civilization, are supposed to be more ready to meet that head on, or what the significance of that is. But basically, they go out to meet the boats, and Jaguar Paw, the protagonist of the movie, retreats into the woods with his spouse, and he says, I think his spouse is like, his wife, is like, should we go out and meet them, or something? Again, in the Yucatec Mayan language, because that's what the entire movie is in, which we'll talk about more. Another quite striking aesthetic choice. And then he says, no, they seek a new beginning, is what he says. And it's left ambiguous, but there's this notion that they should retreat, that they kind of, you could interpret this scene in many ways, but it's kind of like, retreating, perhaps. Again, the scene is open for interpretation, whether these Spaniards are portrayed as saviors, or whether there's this notion that they are themselves going to commit more violence, or perhaps, and I think that in the nuanced and just concerned with realism, not realism, but concerned with verisimilitude, aesthetic vision of Mel Gibson, I think probably he's trying to say both. There is a, as a religious person, he must think there is a literal salvation, coming to these people by way of Europe and by way of Catholicism, but also, the more secular, pro-Western arguments about, civilization is ultimately going to improve for them. I think Mel Gibson, as a man of the right and as a Catholic, is no stranger to that, but he also doesn't shy away from, I think, the notion that this is going to be a very violent new beginning, and it's maybe not something that the protagonist of the movie, which again we have a very positive take on. So this isn't some racist thing like, oh, he's not ready for it. It's more like, you know, in those ancient medieval pictures where you see people perhaps retreating from the light of Christ or something. That's not always portrayed negatively. There's that sense that something there could be a new beginning or a salvation that is so awesome that you do have to avert your eyes. That would be a very, very pro European reading of it. But again, that scene, as with so many others, you know, it's a little bit, for as true a believer as Mel Gibson is, I do think it's open for interpretation. It's not heavy-handed. It's not ideological. It's just trying to portray things as they were, and in the violence and kind of shock and awe that they, you know, would have invoked at the time.
Absolutely. And in our notes to this episode, we described Mel's style, specifically in The Passion, but in his other movies too, as war is the father of all things meets Jesus Christ.
Right.
So
that's what's amazing. I mean, that's
Blood
the revelation
Meridian meets the Christ. And I think in all of these stories, you know, in all of these films, Braveheart, I mean, it's essentially like this idea that like a Christianity with the guts put back in it, the blood and guts put into it. And at all of these, in all of these like climaxes of, you know, of blood and pain, the William Wallace, he's disemboweled, he cries out, he's but then that's not the end of the movie. The end is you have a kind of like postscript where it shows that Robert the Bruce completed the rebellion that William Wallace started, and he won. And so that moment of sacrifice by William Wallace, suppose the movie frames it in such a way, who knows if this is historically accurate, but it frames it in such a way that the Robert the Bruce, who won the Scottish independence, you know, in 13 something from the English, he was inspired by William's suffering, how much he believed, and that gave him the strength to rally the you know, the remaining clans to, you know, continue the fight. And so you look in that, and obviously, so like in The Passion, the apostles and everyone were, you know, so awestruck by Jesus's suffering and his, you know, resurrection, although that was not really part of the first Passion. They're doing a sequel. That his suffering foretold a later glory. And so too did William Wallace's. And so too did, I'm not as, I did see Hacksaw Ridge. I don't remember it quite as well, but I think in Apocalypto, so what struck me in this scene is like they're on the beach, they see he's running from the other tribe who are bad guys. They're going to catch him and kill him. And then he sees the arrival of the conquistadors and the cross. And it's a kind of ominous moment because it's a moment of dramatic irony because you, the viewer, know much more than he does. And you know that that cross is bringing civilization, but it is also bringing extreme violence. And so it's this moment where, you know, at this moment of kind of climax through, I mean, in the case of Apocalypto, maybe the real violence hasn't occurred yet, but it also portends a salvation. And clearly, Mel, as a Christian and, you know, a man of the right, would believe that the conquistadors brought to the native populations here salvation. And so that too. And in Hacksaw Ridge, I mean, he, through his bravery and what have you, literally saved lives and what have you. So
yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely the theme is that kind of, as we said, salvation and triumph, but only at the expense of sacrifice and you know, to an extreme degree. And
like in Hacksaw Ridge, if this guy, this pacifist who doesn't want to fight, if he succeeded in being a pacifist and never be entering the war, which is what he wanted to do. But they said, no, you got to go to the war. You got to
Yeah.
go. And so he said, well, okay, but I'm not going to carry a gun. I'm not going to kill anyone. And they said, fine, you could be a medic, but and if you don't want to carry a gun, that's on you. And so they sent him there. But it's this acknowledgement that like you can't skip the blood and guts if you want to get to salvation, because if he and Hacksaw Ridge succeeded and stayed home, he wouldn't have been on the battlefield. He wouldn't have saved all those men who he saved. And there would have been certainly no corporal sort of salvation for those men. They would be dead. And also the spiritual, the great glory and victory of, I believe it's Desmond Das was
Yeah.
the soldier from Hacksaw Ridge.
Mhm.
He would not have achieved that victory if he had denied or refused to descend into the blood and guts of the world.
Right. That's a really good way of putting it. And you alluded to it earlier. The vision you get in Mel Gibson is Christ meets war as the father of all. It's, it's has as deep an appreciation, understanding, and frankly reverence for violence as books we talked about on this podcast, like Blood Meridian, maybe Heart of Darkness. There's this sense that the realm of men is this realm of blood and guts and violence and suffering, and that we can't really see our way out of that. I don't think Mel is a Gnostic. He's a traditional Catholic, so he's definitely not. But he's of that sort of Christian or Catholic ilk where the appreciation for the degree of suffering in the world is so great that it's almost, it's not Gnosticism, because that's a critical step of like actually, believing matter is evil or whatever, which he doesn't. He believes it's redeemed by Christ. But nevertheless, he comes close enough. There's gradations of that within Christianity. How close or far you are from any degree of Gnosticism. And there's Gnosticism. That's a whole nother topic, of course. It's generally portrayed negatively, and on our side, generally portrayed negatively. Some people, critics like American conservative critic Eric Voegelin, have even described, have basically described leftism as a form of Gnosticism. I think there's something to that, but then you also have, like in Bap's book, where he talks about how, not that Gnosticism is like metaphysically true. Bap is kind of an affirmer of life, like Nietzsche, but nevertheless, he talks about how conditions on Earth and conditions of a certain kind of life can become so intolerable that the Gnostics are like, kind of functionally correct. So there's this kind of mixed take on this sort of thing. All in all, I think the overall view is not that any of us should be Gnostics, but that something about those more extreme takes on the meaning of suffering kind of may or may not be missing definitely from modernity writ large, and even from modern takes on Christianity and Catholicism. There's this kind of the sugar coating that happens where it all boils down to I love you, you love me, Jesus loves us all type sentiments. And there's, it's not just a problem with Catholicism or Christianity, it's a problem with our entire modern lives are kind of insulated from this foundational civilizational violence, while Mel Gibson, while being a very firmly believing Catholic, kind of dips into this in a way that we associate less with religious people, associate less with, definitely Christians and Catholics, but he's not afraid to take that, stare into the abyss, so to speak. I mean, I don't know if Cormac McCarthy, writer of Blood Meridian, has like I don't think he's an atheist per se, but he's not like a religious guy either. He's more of, there's this understanding that he has this kind of brutal Nietzschean, and obviously Nietzsche being an atheistic figure, no doubt, understanding of basically the void and the role of violence in maintaining civilization, and how just kind of unpretty that is. Mel has that while bringing it into contact with extremely traditional Catholicism. No easy feat, but I really think he achieves it definitely in The Passion, but also in Apocalypto and in his other work.
Agreed, Matt. Agreed. I think another aspect we wanted to talk about was how in Apocalypto he kind of made the movie that the wokesters are always like saying they're trying to make. They're trying to
Right.
make a movie that is like has no Western influence and
Mm-hmm.
is like in the about the lived experience of non-Western people. And well, guess what? The only guy, as far as I can tell, who really did that was Mel Gibson. So suck on that, wokesters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting irony to it. He makes this movie. He uses indigenous actors. He films on the Yucatan Peninsula, and crucially, which is and this is I think probably an idea that he originally got from making The Passion in the original Aramaic, I believe. Um,
Yes.
but he shoots the entire movie in the Maya, the Yucatec Mayan language, which is basically an ancient language that I there may be people who still speak it. I'm not 100%. In any case, it's no easy feat to have that level of commitment to verisimilitude and to really portraying and there's by no means any as many historians will tell you did Mel do a perfect job of this. My understanding is the criticism is that the Mayans in Apocalypto are portrayed more like Aztecs, what the type of
Sure.
sacrifice, human sacrifice the Aztecs were engaging in central Mexico at that time, as opposed to what the Mayans were engaging in on the Yucatan Peninsula. To most of us, and I think probably to most even indigenous people and Mexicans, what have you, I don't think it really bothers them too much. It's technically a something of a factual inaccuracy, but it's not the world that is portrayed is a world that existed, even if it wasn't exactly like that. So it's not that everything is historically accurate, but just in
Yeah.
terms of of embracing and absorbing you into the world of the movie,
Like it's
really
close enough. Like it was the
close
series
enough.
Vikings historically accurate. No, none of these histories are like 100%
Oh yeah, and by the
historically
way,
accurate.
including Braveheart,
Yeah,
which
including Braveheart.
he got accused of Anglophobia, which who knows, and also had I haven't even read the laundry list of these, but certain historical inaccuracies. And Mel Gibson has commented like he did them consciously for the sake of the story. Some people have a big issue with that when we're dealing with history. I personally don't. I personally get it. I think that there's emotional truths that can be told in tweaked historical narratives. No problem with that. And also, again, to bring it back to the woke issue, like in as far as there are historical inaccuracies in Apocalypto, well, I think by and large they're actually less significant than those in Braveheart. So it's not just it's
Yeah.
not just a race thing. But long story short, as you said, there is this tremendous irony that he made this movie that really ticks a lot of boxes that kind of more woke film criticism would claim to be looking for,
Yeah.
and does so in a way that I can't really think of a similar woke movie that does that. Obviously there's movies that are actually made by indigenous people, whatever. I'm not saying it's the wokest movie ever, but I think that it ticks a lot of boxes and doesn't get credit for that because it's made by Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
Um,
I think one of the interesting things here is like it's something I've said a lot and probably many kind of many people on the right have said that they're interested in other cultures. They want to
right.
see stuff about other cultures. And when when people ask me more libs or whatever, well, what's your problem with these, movies that center other cultures? The problem is they don't center other cultures. They center a critique of the hegemonic or not the hegemonic, a critique of the of white people, really.
Basically,
That's
yeah. Or
they center a critique of white men, and that's the point of these multicultural movies that they produce on Netflix or whatever. And so contrast that with a movie that is actually about another culture. It's not about white people at all until the end. And this was fascinating to watch. I enjoyed watching it.
Yeah.
Similarly, I enjoyed watching Ran, which was a movie, I believe, by Kurosawa. Somewhat modeled, yes, on King Lear, but it was about warring Japanese, you know, army factions, trying to
Yeah.
compete for the shogunate or something like that. I don't exactly remember, but the point is, I think people on our side and the kind of the good faith criticism of these woke movies is that they are not portraying the authentic experiences of black or brown people or whatever. What they are doing is they're portraying, their grievances against and their agenda against white men, frankly.
Yeah,
And
no, very often that, or they bring in intersectional elements that kind of distract from that. It's going to be a movie
yeah,
about this group of indigenous people, but it's also feminism or something. Um, Listen, I'm not saying there aren't. Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the Kurosawa film. There's movies that are about that are about indigenous people that that may be good, other than Apocalypto. But the point is that even though Mel has a very right of center take on things, he still had a commitment to understanding the Yucatan tribes and the Mayan civilization on its own terms. I think that's what's critical. And there's a lot of that on the sort of right wing. There's a lot of people who do in fact have a great appreciation, and arguably a better appreciation for other cultures and understanding their customs and ways, and honestly learning from those customs and ways when they can. That has you can have that without having globalism. Without, I
I
mean,
mean,
we
I
kind of have
think
a left.
not
Yeah,
only can you have that without having globalism, globalism prevents you from having that. And that's an old saw on the right, on the dissident right, but I think it's true. When you kind of employ this form of globalism that denigrates the culture of the heritage people who founded the nation, it will lead to kind of resentment and what have you that will make it more difficult to appreciate the cultures of other people. But I think it is actually somewhat right wing, and
hmm
Dugan, for instance, would agree with me that
yeah, no, absolutely. He has a
to
book. Go on. Yeah,
appreciate all the different cultures in for on their own terms, not like like how do they interact with our culture, how have they been victimized by our
right.
culture or whatever, but more a fascination and appreciation for different that implicitly means that your heritage culture in the West has a culture of its own and a way of, and so that's the thing that you can't say that there's a Swedish
Ethnos.
culture, there's
The
an
worst one. Yeah.
ethno yes, there's an ethnos. And but the thing is, there are, of course there is an ethnos, there are many ethnos is. and
Yeah.
um and I think you have to kind of be on the right to appreciate, to make an Apocalypto, to make a
Absolutely.
movie that's totally devoid of any sort of grievance, any sort of like victimhood, whatever, and just, appreciate these people on their own terms.
Yeah, and learn not learn from them in a like oh, they knew things we didn't know way per se, but more just understand that there's a humility. I think Mel's not to say this ad nauseum. Mel is a Christian. Mel is a Catholic. Mel has a certain view of those crosses on the sails at the end of the movie, but nevertheless, and this is explicitly stated by him, his purpose in making this movie. I have an actual quote in my notes here that I'll pull up. Mel said Apocalypto is merely the backdrop for a more universal story exploring civilizations and what undermines them. So he's, there's not this sense of, these backwards Indians, these backward indigenous people, did human sacrifice, and then Christianity came in and saved the day. He probably believes that on some level, but he was very explicit that that what can be seen in the Mayan civilization in this film is still relevant to us today. Yes, we have, yes, we are supposedly Christian civilization now, but we are still susceptible to these old human this old human condition of basically needing violence to continue civilization. This would be really, really out there, but Mel as one of our guys, quote unquote, he's a man of the right, but he was somewhat critical, perhaps even very critical, although he didn't say too much about it, of the Iraq War, and that's around the time Apocalypto came out. Could you do in a leftist college professor way, do a quote unquote reading of Apocalypto where it's critical of the kind of neocon argument for war as a progenitor of as something that keeps the motor of civilization running? I think that you could kind of speculate. I don't think Apocalypto is an anti-war film per se, but I think that and again, I think Mel is not super ideological. He's not trying to. That's one reason why I wouldn't exactly make that reading of it as a criticism of the Iraq War and of neoconservatism, because I don't think he's trying to be that on the nose. And he definitely, he said this, like he's against, in many words, he has an appreciation for warriors and soldiers. BAP would probably say something similar. It's a nuanced thing. It's not ideological, but nevertheless, there's a subjective look at like the one, in the life cycle of civilizations. They're founded on violence. They have a golden age, and then as they start to unravel, kind of new and different forms of violence must be, wind up being executed in order to preserve that virility. And I do think I don't think Gibson's read Evola or Gwenon or Dugan, but he is, maybe it's something inherent to being that level of a traditionalist, in his case a Catholic traditionalism. There's that understanding of the civilizational cycles, which again he explicitly said Apocalypto was about. There's not detached, because as a traditionalist you're no moral relativist, you have a take, but nevertheless there's this understanding that civilizations are going to rise and fall, and there's going to be horrific violence at the outset and at the end, and some of it is going to lead to transcendence, and others of it is just going to be ugly. I think you get all of that in the sort of picture he portrays.
War is the father of all things, including movies.
Of significance to the whole kind of woke versus Mel Gibson's approach in Apocalypto is the fact that this movie is actually very well regarded in Mexico. It did very well. Well, as with The Passion and other films, it did very well in the box office globally, but specifically, it did very well in Mexico and is well regarded even today. I think there was some kind of poll that was taken. It was also screened kind of early on to Native American groups in the United States, and basically, was well received. So this is kind of your classic case of the actual group of people that supposedly this could potentially be offensive to, actually really, really like it, because it kind of meets more their culture where it is, which, in many ways, it's a much more masculinist culture. And any kind of more critical take on it came from, just kind of more middling type critics at these sort of mid-tier publications. The film, and one of the reasons, and I hate to even admit that this has any bearing on what I choose to watch, but sometimes when you're when there's so many movies out there, you do look at reviews, and I always tell like, Apocalypto has a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes. I kind of went into my thinking that it's probably just basically an action movie, but then you look at kind of who gave what reviews, and you find out it's not that it's just a lukewarm movie, it's that it was a polarizing movie, with some people dismissing it and others praising it. And, the people that praised it were people like Quentin Tarantino, Robert Duvall, Martin Scorsese, Edward James Olmos, and even not exactly a friend of the pod here at New Right per se, but even Spike Lee, listed as just one of the all-time great films. So that's a pretty diverse, not just racially, but just like in terms of, different people from, big names from across the film industry, basically thought this was a masterpiece. And also more serious critics, A.O. Scott had a kind of funny quote, is like, say what you will about his problems with booze and certain groups, but Mel Gibson, is a serious filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives the lie to the idea that that people of color, what have you, these groups that the woke people make movies for, that they want those type of movies, that they want movies that center like, political correctness and intersectionality and victim narratives. They don't. No one wants that shit. We don't want it.
Yeah.
They don't want it. And so, like, yeah, I mean, it's no wonder that this was popular in Mexico, because it's like a based retelling of indigenous history in Mexico.
Yeah,
I mean,
and not just indigenous history, but how, because obviously Mexico is no longer explicitly indigenous. They do, the self-regard in Mexico. Not that I'm an expert on it, there is this understanding that it is the combination of the indigenous people with the Spaniards. That's
absolutely
accepted. It's not, obviously there's kind of more woke elements there as anywhere else, and there's a whole complicated history of it, but nevertheless there is an understanding, that they are the product of this violence. And how do you what kind of regard does one have for that? It's not that you necessarily love every element of the violence, but you understand that it is how you came to be. So yeah, it's not surprising at all to me that it is well regarded in Mexico. And
because Mexicans today are, in a way that perhaps it's a more healthy understanding of your nation's origins. They are the descendants of both the conquistadors and the indigenous people, and so they have that heritage in them of both sides. And in America, we all know what America is. It's an economic zone, Matt. The Great Babylon. These days, it wasn't always. It wasn't always that way.
Yeah.
But I fear that is a bit afield for this conversation.
A little bit, but nevertheless, it is interesting, and I kind of think about these different, what would the American version of Apocalypto be? Well, I guess we have it in our Western films, but it's not. It's a very different story. We can leave it at that. Basically, it has a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, and again, pretty much all the critics that really matter seem to praise it. It got bad reviews from places like Salon.com, which honestly, news to me that Salon.com even existed in 2006, but I suppose it did. I kind of think of Salon as having risen to much more prominence in the kind of golden age of woke. But they were obviously still there, even making trouble in 2006, and basically of significance to the context in which Apocalypto came out. This came out, 3-4 years after The Passion. It was at the height of Mel Gibson's controversy. Infamy. So, I mean, there really is, and it's no secret that this happens with film criticism. There's people who are canceled for good and bad reasons, and then the movies they're in get pummeled. This is totally an aside, but just as an illustration of the way that this happens, there was a movie from, I think, 2021 called Crisis, about the opioid crisis, that had Armie Hammer in it. And by all accounts, this was a good movie, but it has really shit reviews because it came out like a month after we learned that Armie Hammer is something of a pervert. It's not, the film criticism world is far from impartial, case in point. And I think Apocalypto is a similar case where, I don't even know if we need to rehash the various comments and incidents that led up to Mel Gibson being infamous in around that era of 2006. But it was basically right at the height of that, and it's hard not to imagine that this might not have been like an Oscar contender and close to 100% Rotten Tomatoes if it weren't for that. Again, the right people still praised it, but there's this sense in which kind of a more striver type class of critics who needed to prove that they were on the right side of the controversy probably laid out everything that was problematic and dragged that Rotten Tomatoes score down.
Yeah, definitely.
But this kind of brings us to I guess we'd be remiss not to talk a little bit more about the kind of more public image issues of Mel Gibson and the trouble that he's gotten into, but also kind of he has come back more recently. He's kind of proved to be somewhat uncancelable in certain regards.
Yeah, a real triumph in some respects.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, I don't know how much we need to rehash all of this. Most people are familiar.
Mel
I guess
went through his own passion story, if you will.
Sort of. And well, it's funny you say that, and it's not just not just in terms of persecution by the media, but even before that, this is kind of just another interesting tidbit about him. He does have this very conservative upbringing and outlook, but he is also a man with demons and struggles. He kind of openly has struggled with alcoholism and booze. I'm not sure if he's sober now or not. I think he probably is, because he definitely, there's drunk driving incidents and all this, that, and the other thing. And I haven't read the full Mel Gibson bio. That could have been an interesting longer podcast where we really delved in sort of Art of Dark style on, the ins and outs of this guy. But basically, if you just a cursory glance through his bio, he was a big Hollywood star in the 80s before we had the Mel Gibson that we know today. He was kind of just one of the main, action heroes of the 80s. And with that, he kind of had a much more worldly lifestyle, banging women, boozing, this, that, and the other thing. This is all part of the Mel Gibson narrative. And apparently there was even times, I don't remember explicitly when this was, but he's on the record as saying, he contemplated suicide in his 30s, as far from traditional Catholicism as that is. He's someone who has really struggled with a lot of the same kind of worldly issues that other celebrities and just other people have dealt with, which is another kind of humanizing characteristic. And it's not irrelevant, I think, to his later more religiously and politically tinged controversies, because he's some of the comments he's made that have been deemed homophobic, anti-Semitic, etc. He's basically said under the influence of alcohol. But
true.
So, I mean, that one again, not to just rehash anyone can find this online. Just go to the controversy section of his Wikipedia page. And obviously, as we alluded to earlier, with some of the memes, like some of these comments are things that people on our side actually appreciate about Mel. But not really to say too much one way or the other from my angle. I kind of view it as more just interesting coloration of what makes this guy an interesting artist with a pulse, who has made some mistakes, to say the least. But also rebounded from those mistakes in an interesting way. By all accounts, like a very loyal friend and a good worker. So he kind of has a lot of allies within the Hollywood system, despite his controversial views. I think that's helped him out a lot. And as I kind of said earlier, it's unclear precisely where he stands with state of acontism and traditional Catholicism, other than to say that he is definitely a true believer. But, I think he's someone who has kind of struggled with what exactly that means in his life. And I think that tension is one of the things that has made his life interesting, and one of the things that ends up being reflected in his work. Again, it kind of, as we talked about, it is religious, but it also has a pretty unflinching take on reality.
Yeah.
Somewhat interestingly, like a lot of people who are state of acontists and tradcats online sort of came to it as a reaction against something, whether a lot of people on our side of things, they maybe decided that the modern world was totally degenerate, which I don't disagree with. And one way to kind of deal with that is to embrace a very traditionalist outlook. Mel is actually not that. Mel is someone who was brought up in a Sedevacantist tradition. So, that with his father Hutton, that is part of his narrative from birth, and it's kind of more like, he entered the Hollywood system from that place and then had his experiences with it and then maybe retreated somewhat back to it, but is always engaged in this process of sort of reconciling his status as an artist and as a member of the Hollywood. He's not a member of the Hollywood establishment, but he's definitely, shoulder to shoulder with them. He's an Oscar winner, reconciling that with an extremely traditionalist outlook. I think it's what makes him interesting. I'm not trying to be willfully vague here and not like explicitly, to give my take on exactly the things Mel Gibson has said, but that is sort of what I find more interesting than the truth value of this, that, or the other thing is how it kind of makes him the artist he is.
Yeah. And, crucially, that's the point of our pod. We're not here to litigate, history and litigate the greater political science and what have you. We're here to talk about the art and how his views have influenced his art. And crucially, one way that his dissident views have influenced his art is it made his art less palatable to the mainstream, and made it so he had to somewhat, though he is a mainstream director, he had to rely upon somewhat parallel and outside of the box marketing, and some of the same things we have been talking about in terms of how do we write our stuff outside of the system and get it published and get it out there. And so, like, yes, The Passion obviously is a studio movie. It was made in the system, but the marketing push was, probably not what it could have been due to, various controversies, due to whatever. But nevertheless, it was a tremendous success. Yeah. And it was due to word of mouth and other, I guess, nascent kind of like internet marketing. So you had people from all around the country, their churches, taking parishioners to see it. You had youth groups seeing it.
I think that's how I first saw it, in fact. And I actually want to fact check you. You give my little actually here. The Passion is not a studio movie.
Oh, really?
Wow. Yeah, no. It's of that level of budget that you would think, but I don't think Mel has that. I mean, Apocalypto was distributed. Sorry, this is like a little bit of a film industry insider's take on things. It was distributed by Apocalypto was distributed by Buena Vista Entertainment. That's owned by Disney. So it's not like the studio system was not involved with movies of this caliber. But these are basically what you'd call not indie films in like a genre sense, but like basically it's independent cinema. I think every movie he's ever made. It's not that it's not totally made outside the system, because a lot of movies are independent in this sense. Yeah. It's made by any number of people involved with it are not like explicit dissidents, but it is all. I think every single one of his movies was produced outside the studio system. His company, Icon Productions, obviously they were pretty flush with cash at some point because they were able to make these, but it's basically an independent film production outfit, which I think kind of understood itself or kind of presented itself as an alternative to the studio system. So this kind of notion of like being an outsider looking in, I think, is probably something that's obviously it's come about more recently with stuff we talk about on our pod, people in our sphere, and then even in Hollywood. And I do want to talk about this before we wrap. Producers, I think his name is like Dallas Salambier or something. And this, some people think it's a cringe reference, but honestly, I've always been all for like Ben Shapiro's
Yeah.
production.
No.
Like, I think it's actually, if he has the money to do that, I think great. Like, I think there should be more of that. But the point is that Mel Gibson was doing this even as of like Braveheart era, even as of like the mid 90s. I think this was before his controversy. I think he understood that he, even just for the freedom of it, didn't want to be controlled by the studio system. And I think that's kind of the ethos of Icon Productions and of a lot of the people he's collaborated with, are to make these, again, it's not right-wing art, it's not ideological stuff. It's stuff made by people with a conservative or even more libertarian mindset who don't want to be controlled by the censors of the studio system. Again, not to go too much on a side. That's the one thing. I haven't actually seen many of these movies yet, so I don't want to take too much of a stance on it. That's one reason why I will vouch for like Ben Shapiro's thing, is because that too does not seem to be it really doesn't seem to be ideological, like dumb right-wing, like pro-war propaganda or something. Like, it does seem like he wants to just make an outfit for people who don't want to kind of conform to the Hollywood ideology, so to speak. He wants to platform creators working in that space. And I think that's kind of what Mel has always been about too, despite having a very particular point of view. His work and a lot of the stuff that he's been a part of and championed, it's not the realm of like of a super specific religious or political point of view. It's more just for the independent minded creator, and that's one of the basis I'll really praise it on. And I think I think I can speak for both of us, Dan, when it's like that's what we're all about with regard to literature too. We're not looking to promote any particular branch of dissident right ideology. It's more just a place where people who are not part of the groupthink can create. I think that's what we've always advocated.
Well, I am actually trying to promote Grunhauerism, but other than that, yes, no, I'm very Catholic in my understanding of the various ideologies and strains of thought that we are trying to produce and cultivate. So I want to, may 1,000 shoots sprout from the ground.
Yeah. Man, I feel like I went on a bit of it. What exactly we were talking about?
So we were talking about Mel as a dissident director, and how with the Daily Wire that you respect what he does, and this, kind of tying Mel to our thing, and doing it outside of the mainstream and yet still finding success. And so, Mel is kind of the preeminent version of someone who has a foot in Hollywood and a foot in dissident media and dissident entertainment. And I think that will become, in the years to come, something that is replicated by many. And
totally. I think that's a really good point. And I'll make this point as well. Like, this is well known, and as it's something I share with a lot of other people in dissident right, including BAP prominently. Like, I'm a big like David Lynch fan, and there's this sadness that or like a Stanley Kubrick fan as well. There's this sadness when looking at the movie industry. Like, I don't think we're going to see a David Lynch or a Stanley Kubrick again anytime soon. Not only for woke reasons, or not even principally for woke reasons, as that kind of like artistic filmmaking is no longer deemed profitable. Like, I'm kind of black-pilled about that. But then I look at someone like Mel Gibson and also S. Craig Zahler, who we'll talk about in a second. And, I think it's true. I think we're going to see less big artistic directors like Lynch and Kubrick, but more like outsider directors who find alternative, kind of funds of cash and are willing to make something that are both artistically interesting, but also, a little more, action flick type that does have that kind of more baseline commercial appeal. I'm actually pretty white-pilled about that. I think as you said, I think we're going to see more Mel Gibsons, more S. Craig Zahlers, frankly, and because the caveat I'll add for my Ben Shapiro praise here is like, obviously there's certain types of movies and types of messaging that we would probably want to see in movies that he himself would censor. So it's far from a perfect thing. I just respect that it is an outsider system type thing. But I think we're going to see more of it, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know if Amanda Milius will be the one or what, but I think that this model of independent film, but not like micro budget independent film, like real, like, teal bucks type stuff, coming in and producing these alternative movies that are both entertaining and have messaging that is refreshing versus refreshing in light of the constant Hollywood messaging. I think we're going to see more of it. I'm much more white-pilled about that.
Absolutely. I mean, it stands to reason because there's a hunger and an appetite for it. There are, disenfranchised writers who want to do it. And, frankly, the only weak link right now is funding. But if, we can begin to get more in the way of funding from our friendly billionaires, or even people like us, or
Yeah, definitely. It's also
putting
again
our
on the
putting our money where our mouth is, and
yeah, definitely
kind of
putting our money
chipping
where our
in.
mouth is. It's also worth noting, it's not just like right-wing investors and filmmakers we need. We do need that. We need visionaries who carry that torch forward, like Zoller, like Gibson. But once you kind of build it and then build it and then they will come. Because when you look at the credits on, obviously Apocalypto and The Passion were kind of made before Mel was as controversial, but like on Hacksaw Ridge, for instance, like, yeah, you have some sort of, more right-wing guys involved, but you also just have, at the end of the day, this is what I'm trying to say. At the end of the day, the film industry is still a business. So if you can kind of get like 30-40% of the way there in terms of funding and in terms of like having a script and good attachments, then there are people who are not necessarily right-wing, but who are nonpartisan enough and pro-art enough that they're going to invest. So I guess I'm not trying to give economic advice to anyone. I only know so much about this, but I guess that's my point. It doesn't have to be totally made from scratch on Twitter. It just needs to, the right connections need to be made. And then the general apparatus of
Absolutely.
The film and the independent film world, which is basically just a lot of producers. Go on, sorry.
The caveat that I would add here is this depends on exactly how right wing is your movie. If your movie is like Apocalypto or something, that's fine. If your movie is like
the Turner Diaries,
or I was gonna say how the 12th Army escapes burning Berlin, but actually that might be fine. Who knows? How essentially the Wehrmacht saved a lot of civilians and led them to the American side. And as I'm saying this out loud, I mean, you would face some pushback, but I don't know. Maybe that could actually sell.
Who knows? I mean, there was a rumor kicking around that Gibson was attached to a movie called Rothschilds a few years back.
Well, I could see that being a little more tricky.
To this day, I'm not sure if that was real or if that was basically fake news. But either way, there's envelopes to be pushed. But there's envelopes that may or may not be pushed. But I think at the end of the day, if you make something, and I really do think with one or two stylistic exceptions, like pretty much Mel has always remained true to that more artistic vision. It hasn't kind of crossed over into the realm of making propaganda or something needlessly.
Absolutely.
So I think if you keep within that realm, if you keep within that realm, I think that you can make artistic products that are going to be nuanced enough to, obviously they'll generate controversy, but they're not going to be like, banned films. They're not going to be on that level, and they're going to be something that that respectable people can attach their name to.
You're not going to have to watch them on Odyssey.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that pretty much stands for the work of Gibson as well as Zoller. Maybe we should do another episode on S. Craig Zoller another day.
I think we will at some point.
I think we will, but maybe we could just tease it here. Because Mel is also in Dragged Across Concrete. I guess I'll say this. That more recent movie than Apocalypto, obviously, and the view on not just the take on masculinity and violence in movies like Brawl and Cell Block 99 and Dragged Across Concrete. But there's other good stuff in there as well. I mean, there's kind of negative views on abortion and on and more traditional takes on gender roles. I mean, these are movies that really bring that stuff to the forefront in a way that if you haven't seen them, you'd be surprised to know that they're not exactly mainstream movies, but they're not so far off, kind of like Gibson's.
Yeah.
These movies are getting made, so there's kind of a white pill to be had there.
Yeah, no, I mean it's Zahler is definitely a white pill that his stuff is coming out and that he's producing this work. And yeah, more so than Mel, I would say that Zahler, and I think as you said, we'll do an episode on him at some point because he really deserves his own episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, he is, I would say, like a real alt-right filmmaker.
Yeah,
He's a
I mean,
filmmaker who
yeah.
like is, like, so Mel is just, he's more of a dissident because of the things he says, and he depicts a very traditionalist message. Zahler is, explicitly anti-woke or explicitly like somewhat alt-right in his movies. And as a result, he's like probably, I think, the par excellence, the director who is like producing these films that are like no holds barred kind of, and it's like it's very, and this is ties into another theme we were going to touch on. His films are very film noir, like
definitely,
pulpy.
especially Dragged Across.
And and on our side we have a lot of guys who are into the noir, into pulp. We're gonna have some connection, some frankly episodes coming up with the guys from Apocalypto Confidential, and they're heavy on the pulp theme. So yeah, this is something that our guys like, and this is something that S. Craig Zahler delivers.
No, very much. And also, I hate to even sound like a woke to bring this kind of stuff up, but just to illustrate that this isn't all about, this doesn't, I mean, I'm using a sort of identity politics type maneuver here to illustrate that actually identity politics are less relevant. But as Craig Zahler, interestingly, he is atheistic, but of Jewish heritage. So, it goes to show it's not all about these kind of narrow, religious and political categories of we need to explicitly make this explicit statement. No, we're just looking for art that is made by people, again, that have this more realistic take on things. So yeah, we'll definitely do Zahler another day. We're a literature podcast, but we like doing these movie pods from time to time. Maybe one day we'll also do Gosling. We've talked about Ryan Gosling as a cultural thing. And then another
he's literally me. Episode.
Yeah, maybe when Barbie comes out. Another name that seems worth mentioning in all this is Vince Vaughn, who's kind of one of these. He's the star of Brawl and Cell Block 99. He's also in Dragged Across Concrete. He's also in Hacksaw Ridge. Vince Vaughn is one of these interesting guys. Great actor, of course. You never really hear him talking about politics, but if you look at who he knows, you kind of know he's like one of our guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's known in Hollywood that he's somewhat right wing.
Yeah,
which
definitely.
In Hollywood is a very sliding scale, but
for sure. Yeah. Well, on that note, we may be about ready to wrap. If you'll indulge me, and Dan, I'm just kind of saying this to you for the first time too.
Yeah.
But it's because I don't think we're ever going to do a full episode on this. I just kind of feel like throwing this out here. Before the end, I just saw Tar yesterday. Have you heard much about Tar?
I have heard about it. I've wanted to see it. I haven't seen it yet. It's about cancel culture in some sense.
Sort of. Yeah, I'll just kind of throw it out there. That's not a Gibson type movie. It is actually also, again, technically by the same notion that Gibson's movies are, an independent feature. We'll see. I think that if it's nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. I think it just won the LA Critics Circle Award for Best Picture. I don't usually follow award season stuff. I think it's kind of a joke, especially now. But I'll just say that if Tar does end up winning the Oscar, which it probably won't, but if it does, that will be a very hopeful sign. Because yes, it's about cancel culture, but similar to kind of what we've said about Gibson and others on this pod, it's not some heavy-handed like weepy story about this is what happens when you get canceled. Rather, it's a portrayal of like a very morally nuanced character. She's not straightforwardly a hero. It's open for interpretation, but nevertheless, it delves into themes about cancel culture and about Me Too that are, they're portrayed objectively. Like these aren't it's not straightforwardly for or against it, I wouldn't say, but it portrays it in a way where one can draw their own conclusions. But basically, it's about one of the leading, concerts conductors, in the world, and she ends up getting first canceled for having kind of anti-woke take at her Juilliard classes, and then later canceled for the perhaps somewhat better reason of grooming young women. She is in fact a lesbian. But what I think is kind of brilliant about the film, and what my reading, and maybe I'll write this as a review, maybe I'll write it as a tweet, but I also kind of just wanted to say it here while it's fresh. I kind of think that you could read, and again, not to overly heap praise on this, we're talking about something that's like intellectual dark web tier, okay? But it kind of, in my opinion, it in many ways is a defense of Western civilization, told through the narrative of a lesbian, which is kind of a brilliant sidestep. You're not no movie about like just some guy who got Me Too'd and having a morally nuanced portrayal of him. No movie like that would get made or praised. When you have it as a lesbian, it's kind of this interesting pivot. But nevertheless, I think it really comes through. It's kind of this, it delves into the changing face of the way things like classical music are regarded. And even though the main character, Lydia Tarr, played by Cate Blanchett, is, it's not some hero worship of her, but I think what comes through ultimately is a defense of the sort of Western gaze or the Western, take on music, despite all of the morally, nuanced elements of it. She is kind of predatory, but what I got from the movie, and again, open for interpretation, I'm looking at it from a right-wing perspective, is this incredible and ultimate defense of Western civilization against the sort of forces that are now degrading it. But I don't know, maybe that's a bit of an aside. It just, the thoughts are fresh. I think it's another example of a kind of based movie, and I just want it out there that if the more awards we see this win, kind of the more hopeful it is that this vibe shift we talk about is actually kind of hitting in the film industry.
Definitely. We have White Lotus. We have this. We have various other artists out there, and we have artists who are like truly out there, like S. Craig Zahler doing their thing on the outside. And there's no one way to win, one way to change the tide. But I think the best way is to be kind of like attacking on all fronts. And this is a way that, if people within the system are able to make movies that are critical of this hegemonic liberalism, that's great. If you're going to form parallel institutions, that's like Zahler, like to an extent, like Gibson, that's great. But the most important thing is that good art gets made, and
absolutely,
that's hopefully what's on the horizon and what's happening today.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think that about wraps us up.
Here we go.